Welcome back to the Last Line of Defense. I have today Ryan Berg. Ryan is the director of the Americas program and head of the Future of Venezuela Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ryan, welcome to the Last Line of Defense. It's been busy for you these last few days.
Thanks for having me on, Seth. Indeed, it's been nonstop, but I'm really happy to make time to be with you and your audience.
All right. Well, what I want to focus on today are sort of the big questions on the political objectives of the administration and the challenges moving forward with governance, law and order, and related issues in Venezuela. So, sort of, what are the big questions the Trump administration is going to have to deal with moving forward in Venezuela? But let me start with Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general and military theorist who repeatedly tells us that war is merely the continuation of policy by other means. So, U.S. had a military operation in Venezuela to remove Maduro, but that military operation has a broader political objective or objective. So, my question to you to start off with is, what do you take to be the administration's key political objectives now, both with Venezuela, and if you want to broaden that to Latin America right now, what are the objectives?
So, no good podcast about an operation that was recently conducted could start without a question about Clausewitz. As I understand it, I think the administration has sort of three broad buckets of political objectives here. One is on the counter narcotics front with Venezuela. The second is reduction in migration. And then the third is looking at how Venezuela is really an accelerant within Latin America for some of our strategic rivals, serving, to put it in the administration's terms, as a beachhead for China, Russia, Iran, to a lesser extent, North Korea. And I think all of those objectives were on the table when the administration was thinking about the operation, whether to launch it, and sort of what comes after as well. The administration left in place remnants of the regime, but the calculation that was made is the de facto, not the de jure president that we recognize as legitimate, but the de facto vice president becoming president is someone with whom we can work, and someone who is more pragmatic, less ideological, more technocratic, someone we can work with in order to get to some of these political objectives. And the administration has said she will be judged accordingly. They're going to forget about who she was or what she did in her past and basically set up some metrics by which to judge her on some of these political objectives following the operation.
Yeah, and I do want to get into a bit more detail on some of the key players. But let me just come back to you on the drugs and illegal immigrants, because I just want to make sure we've got the data right here. So I certainly don't want to underplay the Venezuelan government's involvement in the drug trade, but I just want to be clear when it comes to drug trade as it relates to the United States. The U.S. does have to deal with cocaine, which is largely produced in Colombia. But the cocaine produced in Colombia that passes through Venezuela, if my DEA data from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration data is accurate, mostly goes to Europe. The fentanyl that has been a big concern in the United States comes largely from Mexico, not Venezuela, with chemicals imported from China. So, and I think when it comes to immigrants, which is a challenge in the United States, my data from the U.S. Census is that Venezuela constitutes about less than 2% of all immigrants in the U.S. So I'm not understating the problem the U.S. has with drugs and illegal immigrants. I guess my question back to you is, how much is Venezuela kind of a linchpin of that?
Well, as you said, the trafficking corridor is a transit route. Much of the coca, Colombia is the largest coca producing country in the world. Much of it comes from Colombia via Venezuela, and then from there through the Caribbean routes, what we call island hopping, either to the United States or, as you state, many times to Europe. What I would argue, Seth, is even if those drugs are going to Europe, the Europeans are the ones at risk, of course, from consuming those drugs of a potential overdose. However, the revenue that's derived from drug trafficking, even to Europe, still boomerangs back to criminal organizations, now been designated foreign terrorist organizations by this administration, in Latin America. So the money, the revenues that they make still allow them to foment chaos and instability in our hemisphere, even if it's not Americans consuming the products that they're pushing. And I think there's a boomerang effect here that the administration is concerned with. And on the migration front, I would argue that the numbers that are important are not how many Venezuelans are in the United States, but how much Venezuela and Venezuelan nationals represented border encounters by the Customs and Border Patrol in significant years, especially under the Biden administration, when the southern border was, let's just say, a little bit less controlled than it is now. Venezuelans represented a significant proportion on a month-to-month basis when CBP would put out its numbers in terms of border encounters with CBP, and so reducing that flow, I think, is a key metric and a key policy goal of the administration. And just to put a quantity on it, to put a sort of fine print on the DEA numbers, Venezuela has increased its drug trafficking in recent years. The DEA said in the first Trump administration that they thought about 250 million metric tons of cocaine would pass through Venezuela, and the government was involved in all sorts of ways in actually moving it through the country using the institutions and the armed forces of that country. But now they're at about 500 metric tons. So it's basically doubled in terms of Venezuela's participation in that cocaine trafficking trade, and we presume much more revenue being derived for the Venezuelan government, for the regime, that is, on the illicit side of the economic ledger, as opposed to the licit side. So that's those are all significant considerations here.
And as we'll talk about in a moment, most of that, most of the personnel in Venezuela that have been reaping the benefits of the drug trade are still in power, with obviously the exception of Maduro. But let me actually come back to the broader governance issue, and I want to focus on this in part, Ryan, because I think there are some challenges ahead in governance, law and order in Venezuela. There are a number of reports in U.S. media about one or more U.S. intelligence assessments done before the military operation, which assessed that top members of the Maduro regime, including Vice President Delcy Rodríguez, would be best positioned to lead a temporary government in Caracas and maintain near-term stability of the country if Maduro lost power. That would be, if that's the case, does that represent, in your view, what it looks like the administration is doing then, is largely decapitating the Venezuelan leader and keeping most of the key personnel intact at this point?
I think that's what it looks like in the immediate term. And I think there's a very strategic calculation going on here that is a strategic calculation based on what the administration believes are lessons learned from past regime change operations, which is to say the type of shock therapy regime change, where overnight you go from one regime type to another, from one political leader to another of very different nature. In other words, to go from Nicolás Maduro and his regime to a regime or a government led by Edmundo González Urrutia and Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, is a lot of shock therapy, right? And it would be a lot for the system to,
Even though she was democratically elected.
even though she was elected in an unfree and unfair election, but they still prevailed, right? Where the regime was overseeing the election, they still prevailed, and they still showed that to the world. And I think that's actually the best way to interpret the president's comments at the post-operation Saturday morning press conference, where he said quite memorably, she doesn't have the respect within the country to rule. He didn't necessarily mean that the people don't like her, although that was one interpretation that people made. I think what he was referring to there is exactly this report that you're talking about, which has now been mentioned in the media multiple times, that she would have difficulty consolidating control over the armed forces, the intelligence apparatus, and so on. in the immediate aftermath of a kind of shock therapy regime change. If that's the correct analysis, Seth, then I think what we need to see Delcy Rodriguez as is a very realist, sort of pragmatic approach where she is a stopgap solution for the moment, where she can provide political stability. The United States has basically selected political stability as the answer over political legitimacy. She doesn't have political legitimacy, but what she can provide is stability in the moment. And perhaps the long term plan is to move to a point where we can get to elections in Venezuela, elections in which the opposition can once again compete. And if that's the theory, you have a slow and gradual theory of change away from Maduro and his regime, as opposed to that kind of overnight shock therapy, which the CIA and other intelligence assessments seemed to doubt, could actually happen
And
successfully.
just to highlight that if the U.S. does continue down this road, this is, for now anyway, a major difference. You mentioned this a little bit, or at least indicated something along these lines. Major difference from 2003, where the overthrow of the Saddam regime, the U.S. actually ran the country from 2003 to 2004 under the Coalition Provisional Authority. That was Ambassador Jerry Bremer, and then handed over to Iraqis. So the U.S. actually ran the country for roughly 1 year, handed over to Iraqis. For the Afghan case, after the overthrow of the Taliban regime, where the U.S., the UN, a range of other countries, European neighbors, were involved in the December 2001 Bonn Agreement, which put together an Afghan government led by Hamid Karzai to move forward, and then had democratic elections. Or even Libya after the Obama administration overthrew Gaddafi, where there was a peace process that was set up. I mean, I think in the end, and I think there's a concerning route that Libya took that descended into civil war and civil unrest. The Libya model was decapitation, but not the same kind of 2003 Iraq or 2001 Afghanistan model. So, I mean, it does represent, it looks like, Ryan, a different approach than what some previous U.S. administrations have taken.
And I think it should be noted not only that there are these important lessons I think the administration has considered in this approach, but they've taken a lot of heat, even from congressional Republicans with whom Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia have a lot of good relationships. They've taken a lot of heat for not pushing for that full transition, and they've taken that heat by basically pushing back and saying, "Look, we've had to swallow some pretty bitter pills here, but we're also very realistic in terms of who has immediate control over the security apparatus and who was immediately poised to take the reins of power here." And in fact, on the way home from Mar-a-Lago back to DC, President Trump said there will likely be elections in Venezuela soon. So I think that lends credence to this idea that elections are likely to happen sometime in the future, but that Delcy is kind of a bowing to reality in the moment. Even if this is a pretty bitter pill for many people to swallow.
So instead of going with the individual who had emerged victorious in the elections last year, the administration is moving forward with Delcy Rodriguez. So let's talk a little bit about um, Delcy Rodriguez and some of the key individuals. Jorge Rodriguez, her brother's president of Venezuela's National Assembly. Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, the interior minister, Cabello. So with Rodriguez, let's just start with her because I think she has been sworn in as the Venezuelan leader. Is a socialist whose father was a Marxist guerrilla. So the administration has now allowed to be put in place in Venezuela a socialist whose father was a Marxist guerrilla running Venezuela right now. Ryan, you can correct me if I've got my facts wrong, but can you tell us a little bit about Delcy Rodriguez now, who's running Venezuela?
Like I said, it's a bitter pill to swallow, Seth, especially after such a successful and tactical success in the operation itself. Um, you're right with your description of her. One more thing that I would add, which I think is important for listeners to know, is that she was handpicked by Maduro to be the vice president, probably on the basis of loyalty and and commitment to the cause and commitment to the cause of furthering this regime. So we shouldn't make any mistake about who this is, and we're essentially entrusting that we have enough coercive tools at our disposal to make her play ball, even though naturally she would be very reluctant to do so. Put yourself in her shoes, excuse me, for a second. You have to simultaneously consolidate control over a party that has a 27-year history of anti-Americanism and using America as the excuse for all sorts of domestic ills, right? That's woven into the fabric of what Chavismo is as a political movement, anti-Americanism and so-called anti-imperialism.
And by Chavismo, you're talking about the President Hugo Chavez,
The
the
movement that
former.
was started by President Hugo Chavez. And you have to dispel simultaneously rumors that you were in fact involved you were perhaps a CIA informant, giving away Maduro, right, and making a backroom deal with the Americans, while at the same time you're supposed to pursue policies where there will be metrics to assess your performance that are pro-U.S. This is a very difficult bridge to span, a very difficult needle to thread for her. And what makes it even more difficult, and this goes to her biography, each individual within the regime that plays an important role has their own faction, right? So Diosdado Cabello, as the interior minister and as a former military guy, has a lot of connections in the security apparatus. He controls, he has a lot of affiliation or support within the armed forces as well. Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, the same. She doesn't come from that same cloth, right? She was European educated. She doesn't come from a military background. And so she has to try to build support within those factions in order to consolidate her control. Her background is that she ran for a while the oil ministry. She had some elements of the portfolio under her watch that were in the intelligence or the counterintelligence, better said, the counterintelligence apparatus. She oversaw prisons for a while, but that's not naturally the block of support you would look to consolidate control in an authoritarian regime like this. So she's got a lot of work to do to consolidate control within the armed forces. And I'll just make one final point, which is last night, we're recording this on Tuesday the 6th. So on Monday the 5th, the day that she was inaugurated, Seth, in the evening, hours after the inauguration, there were gunshots that rang out around the presidential palace and anti-air missiles went off. Now, in the end, it turned out they were just shooting at a rogue Venezuelan drone that wasn't responding to orders to move away. But many of us, when we heard this, analysts of Venezuela, we thought a palace coup was taking place, and that most likely Padrino Lopez or Diosdado was making their move. It was making his move on power. And the fact that we could believe that credibly just goes to show, how much difficulty she's going to have to consolidate support within some of these other factions.
Yeah. So I do want to get shortly to some of the challenges in regime change, because there's been actually a fair amount of work, and there's a deep literature on some of the challenges involved in foreign imposed regime changes. But before we do that, I just want to stick with sort of the Venezuelan leadership structure that sits under Delcy Rodríguez right now. As you look at the infrastructure right now, the intelligence services, interior ministry, defense, and even at the National Assembly, is it safe to say that you still see in place in Venezuela the primary power structures that existed while Maduro was still Venezuelan leader? And that includes individuals involved in the drug trade, individuals involved in close relations with the Cubans, the Iranians, the Chinese, the Russians, and others. So that structure is largely still in place at the moment.
I think that's the best understanding at the moment until we get proof otherwise. It seems as though many of the structures are still in place, with maybe one important exception, which is that the loyalty of the armed forces, I think, needs to be checked time and time again, especially given that they were essentially nowhere to be found in the early morning hours of Saturday, January 2nd. Right, I can tell you one place that they weren't. They weren't defending the nation particularly well in those morning hours, and that should make many in the regime quite nervous about their loyalty. That's not to say that they're all of a sudden on the side of the democratic opposition, but what they're probably doing is what we anticipated they would do is kind of retreat for a moment, assess the situation, take a look at sort of who's up, who's down, and then eventually make a move back forward and cast their loyalty, either with the democratic opposition or with the regime, depending upon which side looked most likely to prevail in any kind of regime change or struggle scenario. But the regime has been very focused on getting the repressive apparatus back out on the streets. Right, there have been very public displays of security forces patrolling streets. There was a decree, an emergency decree passed by the Delcy Rodríguez regime, which basically says anybody who is found as having participated in the Operation Absolute Resolve from the United States would be summarily locked up, and they're actively searching for people on the streets who were allegedly involved in this operation. So all of the security apparatus, the sort of terror mechanisms, the social control that they exercise over the Venezuelan people seems to me to be in place at the moment.
So that leads, though, to some questions as we look over the next several months and possibly even years of Venezuela. There has been a lot of good work on regime change and the implications of regime change. What do you assess to be sort of the key potential challenges of domestic stability and instability in Venezuela?
I think the best or probably the most immediate risk that we face is some kind of power struggle within Chavismo itself, right? That Delcy is unable to consolidate control domestically within the elite ranks of the regime, and that the power struggle has some kind of fallout domestically in Venezuela. Power struggle between her and Diosdado, a power struggle between her and Vladimir Padrino Lopez, or someone else making their play for control. Not necessarily that we descend into civil war or chaos of the kind we've seen in other regime change operations. I'll give you a couple of reasons why. I mean, Venezuelans are uh, united, particularly behind Maria Corina Machado, politically speaking. You don't get the same kind of ethnic cleavages and divisions in Venezuela that you get elsewhere. And religiously, right? The religious lines of conflict have been important in a lot of other contexts. You don't get that in Venezuela either.
So, just to push back a little bit on Machado, though, she's not the one that's in power at the moment. So, I think one interesting question is whether if you if the Trump administration holds off on involving what many, even in the international community, assess to be the sort of democratically elected leadership of Venezuela, will that create fissures both within the country and within elements of the diaspora population?
Oh, I think it absolutely will. It'll create fissures within the country where she still has a wellspring of support, and outside as well. You've already started to see that and I gave the very stark example of even within congressional Republican leadership on Capitol Hill, saying, "Why aren't we moving to Maria Corina and Edmundo?" And the answer is basically, you got to swallow bitter pills sometimes. And the assessment is that they weren't ready to successfully grab the reins of power in Venezuela, such as it's currently constituted. And so that one of the challenges I think the administration will have is satisfying that crowd, and they're not an insignificant crowd, Seth. It's a significant diaspora internationally, but it's also a position that's supported even among Republicans that otherwise support the president very strongly on foreign policy. So they're going to have a very clear plan for how they plan to steer this most likely toward a set of elections, which can answer that question about political legitimacy, which we've decided to forego right now
Mm,
in favor of stability.
mm. Well, we will see how that evolves. Ryan, I wanted to just take a moment to highlight the military operation and then ask you about Cuba and other countries in the region. So, I mean, from a tactical perspective, if you look at Operation Absolute Resolve, I mean, these are some of the units that I was historically involved in the special operations community. The efforts by Delta Force, elite U.S. Army forces to snatch and grab Maduro and his wife were effective. It is interesting. I think people often forget the massive amounts of other agencies involved in efforts
Yes.
along these lines. It does appear that at least in the summer of 2025. I've heard August, although I don't know that we have fidelity on that. A clandestine team of CIA case officers slipped into Venezuela to start collecting information on the ground, so human of
Building that pattern of life
Maduro.
against Maduro.
Right, but that pattern of life, as we know from two and a half decades of operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, and other countries, includes DIA assessments, NSA, National Security Agency, and signals intelligence collection, NGA, so the satellite imagery analysis. All of that goes into pattern of life assessments of Maduro, who, from all indications, was rotating between about a half dozen to 8 or so locations. And so when the special operations team was set to go in, you can't do that without taking out the air defense systems, some of the communication, and does look like the beginning of that operation, actually not entirely unlike the beginning of the Ukraine war, started off with cyber operations. The U.S. ones were much more effective of cutting power to large swaths of Caracas, shutting the city in darkness. And then you had fixed-wing aircraft like F-35s and bombers start targeting the radar, air defense batteries, command and control locations. And then you had the soft helicopters in this 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment come in and snatch and grab Maduro. This went along without with as far as we're aware, no American killed in the process. No American military or intelligence professionals killed in that process. It does lead to some interesting questions with the tactical success of that operation, whether and to what degree the U.S. may look at something along these lines elsewhere. So, sort of my last question to you really is, if you're sitting in Cuba right now or other places in Latin America, what are you concerned about?
Yeah, and so you can connect this question to a question I didn't fully answer at the outset of this conversation, which is what are the implications for the region? Well, the implications for the region is that other countries are on the radar. The U.S. has crossed the Rubicon, which it hadn't crossed in a long time, of some very significant military action in Latin America. We're not accustomed to seeing this. General Kane made this point at the Reagan Defense Forum a couple weeks ago. We are going to have to become accustomed again to seeing large scale military operations in Latin America. He said it almost as if he was previewing this operation.
I
Um,
was I was there in person.
you were
I
there in
saw it.
person. You saw the interview. It was full of nuggets. It was full of interesting quotes. But that's the one that I took away from it, and figured that he was kind of presaging or previewing some kind of operation against Venezuela. And I think in the moment, the president is of course basking in what should be the credibility of an incredibly complex, extraordinary operation, which seemed to go off without a hitch, and as you mentioned, zero KIA as far as we know. Um, that said, are we going to all of a sudden perform a similar type of operation against Cuba, against Nicaragua, against any other government we don't like in the region? We know from Dan Kane's assessment at the Mar-a-Lago press conference, this took 6 months to put together. This is not the kind of thing, as you well know, Seth, that you do every other week just nonchalantly, right? This is something that takes a long time to prepare. It takes a concerted effort. And even then, this is touch and go until the final moment of whether the conditions are just right to be maximally auspicious for success. And so, the Cubans are certainly concerned, especially when it comes to the political goals here of sundering that nexus between Venezuela and Cuba on the energy front. Will they fall of their own accord if they don't have energy from Venezuela provided to them for free? It's possible. It's possible, but I think it's less likely that we're going to see tons of military preparations against Cuba, in the coming weeks, just because the president says that they could be next. Colombia, Mexico, other countries that have been mentioned by the president. If anything happens there, I think it's more likely to be, extension of the boat campaigns in the Southern Caribbean, bringing, say, a drone strike on military or on terrorist organizations on land, than it would be some kind of deposing of governments in either country. I think the president saying that in the moment in the context that he did has confused a lot of people and thinking we're interested in regime change in all these other places. It's more so a demonstration of U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere, which very much dovetails with this idea of a Trump corollary in the Americas, which was outlined in the National Security Strategy. That, I think, is the
A
important takeaway here.
corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
A
Yeah.
corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. That's one of the most important takeaways here is the United States is becoming much more sharp-elbowed in its own shared neighborhood. It previewed this in the National Security Strategy document. That set off a lot of debate about whether it was mere bluster or whether it was actual policy and it would be guiding actual policy. Less than a month later, we have a demonstration and a clear answer. It's going to guide policy. It's not mere bluster.
Well, we will see how that evolves, Ryan, over the next several days, weeks, and months. I really appreciate you coming on the last line of defense, and thanks for your insights. They were superb.
Thanks, Seth.
Thanks for listening to our episode today. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For more analysis, please visit csis.org. This is The Last Line of Defense.